everybody, today on the channel a little bit more of petrolhead philosophy, and in this episode we are asking, can a great engine make a bad car into a good one? And is it really just the lack of an engine that is stopping EVs from possessing what many of us would call a soul? And the background for today, it is this 2010 Audi RS5. The RS5 is that most interesting of cars. When it came out, it certainly drew a fair bit of attention, and why wouldn't it? It looks pretty darn good. Okay, not exactly a shouty thing, but it's a very confident, handsome design. In fact, Walter de Silva, who penned it, called it his most beautiful piece of work. And this is a man that has a number of rather dramatic things in his portfolio, including the likes of several Alfa Romeos. But you know what? I don't think he's wrong, because even the original A5 still looks magnificent, in spite of the fact it was introduced now knocking on for 20 years ago, back in 2007. Yeah. Can you believe that? In just 3 years' time, that car is going to be 20 years old. An Audi A5 might be eligible for classic car insurance. Oh dear. Just in case for some reason you have over the last 2 decades been living under a particularly opaque rock, what is the A5? Well, it is the coupe version of the Audi A4. And perhaps unfortunately for Audi, though it was a great car, it was up against some mighty competition, with the 3 Series of the day, the E46 having just been retired, to be replaced with the E90 generation. And though there were and are many who feel that car was a little bit of a backward step, by today's reckoning, it's still a fantastic thing. Likewise, the W204 generation of Mercedes-Benz C-Class. Today, I think, a little bit of a design classic. And of course, that is the era that gave us the mighty, the madcap 6.2-litre naturally aspirated V8 C63. BMW, meanwhile, for their sporty car, the M3, then gave us a different flavour of V8, displacing far less, only 4 litres, but making nearly as much horsepower, 420 versus the Merc's initially 457, naturally with less torque, but compensating for it, a barking mad redline of over 8,000 RPM. And whether it is coincidence or design, I could not say, but for this generation, Audi themselves also decided that the one and only way to go was a V8, which in the S5 and the RS5 was a naturally aspirated design, closer in philosophy to that of the M3 than the C63, and it displaced 4.2 litres. And though today it is very easy to look at both the S5 and RS5 simultaneously, in actual fact, customers had to wait some 3 years for Audi to release the truly hot version of the A5 platform, with the S5 landing along with the regular A5 in 2007, and this one finally landing in 2010. But when it did, that 4.2 litre had been turned up to 11, here making a BMW beating 444 horsepower. That's 450 PS. That meant that this, the Executive Coupe Express, also made marginally more power than Audi's in-house supercar, the R8, which at this point in time was still relatively new and in base guise could still be bought with the V8. Effectively the same engine as you have here. And though over the years I've tried to work out exactly what the differences are between that engine and this one, I have never managed to get a definitive answer. There are those who tell me that this one is effectively a version of the V10 that around about the same time they started to sell in the R8 as well, only with 2 cylinders lopped off it. And then there are others that tell me of course it's not that silly, it is in fact just an evolution of the other 4.2 litre V8. Regardless, it's a brilliant engine. Has a red line here of some 8,200 plus RPM. yet even low down at 3,000 like I am now, it's got plenty of pull and a very distinctive soundtrack. This car has been brought to me by its kind owner, John, and as you might be able to tell, I'm here testing it on one of my favourite routes up in Scotland. Today is not a review, but I think it's worth taking a couple of minutes just to talk about this car, because there are a few things different about it compared with the last RS5 that I drove. The first one was in fact a little closer to this, but I reviewed that some 6 years ago. The second one though was an example of the facelift, and the RS5 is a bit odd really, because this model, as we mentioned, launched in 2010, and it was facelifted only just about a year to 18 months later, making these early pre-facelift versions relatively rare. And though there are lots of things to be said for the later car, it's got a newer, revised, slightly sharper and better looking exterior, better, more modern interior, this one counters by still having hydraulic steering. And where Audi and VW Group in general often get criticised by many, myself included, for having kinda poor steering, this I actually like a fair bit. It is not the best in the world, and of course the RS5 is, as with many hot Audis, dynamically compromised. That engine sits far forward in Audi tradition, meaning this car weighs not just 1.8 tons, but has 56% of it over the front axle. To try and compensate, they did a few different things, including introducing an element of brake steer to try and make that front end a little livelier and mean that it will turn in a little more keenly. Whether it has actually worked or not, I'll put to the test shortly. But the fact remains that this is a very nice, interactive and hefty feeling car to drive. It has a reassuring solidity about the whole thing. And despite the fact that this is one of those earlier cars, so it's now about 13 or 14 years old, it still feels very well made. The A5's interior was always one of the best of its generation, and where today a W204 Merc's interior does feel a little bit cheap in places, this one doesn't. John picked this car up in November. Previously, he had an A4, partly on account of the fact that he did big miles and so wanted something a little more economical, and partly on account of the fact that he had a dog. Unfortunately, he no longer has the dog, and so decided to take the opportunity to buy something a little bit fruitier. Having been interested in Audis for quite some time, something sparked by the release of the original Quattro over 40 years ago, he decided to carry on with the badge and settled for this, the RS5. And he did so for all of the reasons that you might imagine anybody would. It looks good, it sounds good, it's got an engine that's very special, and it's just him and his partner. The fact that the rear seats are a little bit compromised, you can get small people in there but not 6 foot plus adults, it didn't matter. It's got a decent sized boot still though, and for the trips he likes to take it on, including earlier in the year the NC500, that makes it just about perfect. This car was also apparently some sort of special edition, though which I have absolutely no idea, and so it is very well specified. You've got the Bang & Olufsen stereo, dual zone climate control, satellite navigation for all the good that it will do you, and the system, it still works okay, but it's quite old now. I do though like the fact you've got a sunroof. That's very, very nice. And with the RS5, unlike the S5, you also had the option of just one gearbox, Audi's 7-speed S-Tronic, their dual clutch box. And you know what? It actually works pretty well. I've been driving this mostly today in manual, put it in auto there, but I was in dynamic, hence the big dramatic flare of revs. Down here you have options for the drive modes, comfort, auto, dynamic and individual. This also alters quite dramatically the weighting of the steering. In comfort mode it's quite a bit lighter, and I actually don't mind it, but I think I might prefer it in dynamic. Yes, it is heavier, and are you getting any more feedback? I'm not entirely sure, but I just like it. It's a bit more reassuring. I often don't, but for some reason in this car I do. Perhaps that is because it is a hydraulic system, and what it's actually doing is just giving me less assistance. So there really is a little more information coming through along with the extra steering effort. But one of the other things that pressing these buttons down here would also change is the suspension. This car came fitted from factory with Audi's DRC, Dynamic Ride Control. However, like many Audis with it, this car has had it replaced. The truth is, it wasn't a great suspension to begin with. Typically, it's very, very firm, especially if you went for the DRC Plus, and it does fail. And when it does, it's not cheap to fix, often costing £1,000 or more a corner, and so many people opt simply to replace it. And this car is now sitting on a set of KWV2s. I think it might be sat a little bit too low for its own good. Over a few sections you could hear the wheels rubbing a little bit. We were out earlier in the car 3 up, and you could tell it was struggling in a few sections. But it is adjustable, so that is something that can easily be sorted. But does that change the nature of this German bruiser? Is it now more sports car, the muscle car? Let's see. Especially, but that's also not a massive issue. It certainly is no wallowy old thing, but then it never really was. And the car's main issue really for me, from a sports car perspective, is the fact that when you go to turn in, that initial response just isn't good enough. You turn the wheel a little and you expect it to do something, and instead it doesn't really do much at all. Turn it a little more and eventually it does pick up, the thing weights up, and it all starts to work. This, though, really is a car more about connecting corners and maintaining speed. And this faster flowing stuff here, oh, it feels absolutely sensational. It loves it. And I'm really, really enjoying it. This is a wonderful thing. That gearbox too, it just works. It might be near 15 years old now, but you know what? I don't think it's really any worse than a lot of the current generation of dual clutch boxes. They got sort of more and more exciting after this, but then a lot of them started to get a little bit less exciting later on. They all sort of became a little smoother, a little flatter. This is perfectly livable. Round town, if you need it to, it'll also do a good impression of a regular automatic box. And if you want to know a little bit more about this car in depth, what it's like to drive, go and check out the review that I did of one, the later one, a year ago. I'll try and remember to put the link in the description down below. But we're here not for a car review, we're here for a philosophy lesson. And there's a few intertwined questions that I all need to answer. The first of which is, can a bad car be made into a good one by the presence of a great engine? And that's a slightly loaded question, because first off, what we have here, it's not a bad car, far from it. And although every single group test of the day, which featured this, then the likes of the M3, the C63, maybe even a Lexus RCF or similar, would have told you that the Audi was nice, but ultimately too heavy, dynamically not accomplished enough, and simply just not as exciting as either the Merc or the BMW. The reality is that we don't live in a world where we do back-to-back tests, and this is a very, very good car. And I must admit, I was always slightly frustrated when group tests of cars like this would involve a section on the track, where of course the M3 was going to beat everything else. But the simple fact is, out of the box, an M3 isn't a brilliant track car. It's fairly heavy, it's relatively soft. You will knacker it fairly quickly if you're going to drive that hard. And I know many, many people who campaign an M3 on track quite successfully. But they've done a lot to their car. This channel is not about track cars, it's about road cars, and that is why this is where I test them all. It is because it is where I do 99.99% of all of my driving, and I believe the same is true for most of my viewers. And right here, right now, am I sat thinking, oh, I wish I was in an M3? No, not a bit of it. And one of the things that I really like about the RS5 is that it isn't an M3. It isn't the obvious choice. And this car also sits really beautifully in that sort of period now where it's old enough to be interesting. It isn't the latest, greatest, the flashiest, the showiest, the fastest, or anything like that. But it's still new enough that we remember it, and most importantly, you can live with it. Will it be trouble-free? No, probably not. And John has just paid a rather large bill to sort a couple of suspension-related issues on this car. However, will it cost dramatically more than an M3 or a C63 of the day? I doubt it. Something also often overlooked, though in dry, decent conditions, the car's standard fit quattro all-wheel drive system will be seen as a bit of a drawback. It adds weight and it may compromise the dynamics. I think for a lot of people, it's a draw, particularly when you consider that both the M3 and C63 were rear-wheel drive, with the latter, in standard guise, being particularly leery. This means that if you do live somewhere like here, north of the border, it's going to be a car that's more usable more of the year. And that can only ever be a good thing. In fact, I have to say, rarely have I driven a car that feels quite so good, quite so tuned in as this on this particular road. It is loving it, and so am I. And so, the RS5 was never ever a bad car. It was never an average car. It was a very good one. But the engine, that is great. And I know for a lot of people, it's that engine which will be the one and only reason to buy this car. And you know what? I would not blame those people at all. I do occasionally feel sorry for the EV. There are lots of people that do quite a bit of moaning about them, and I include myself in that list. But I think the biggest problem with them isn't the fact that they are electric, it's the fact that they're being designed and built now. And most of the people that I know who don't really like EVs also don't really like most of the other combustion engine cars that are being built at the present time. And part of that's got to do with the fact that they're all a little bit samey. They have also been overburdened with things that most of us drivers don't want. And it's something that's really nice about this car. I mean, you just look at it and yeah, it's got lots of nice stuff, lots of toys and things in here. And when it came out, it would have been a very, very well specified car. But today, it's more about the things that it doesn't have. So it doesn't have radar guided cruise. It doesn't really have any ADAS system. There is no lane departure warning. If I drift over the middle of the road, it will simply let me. There is no forward collision avoidance, and mercifully, the pedal doesn't vibrate if there's a roundabout coming up. It does though still have traction control, stability control, and ABS, all things that I would deem an essential. So it's got all the things that you need to keep you fairly safe, but none of the stuff that will make you go a little bit soft and forget that you are supposed to be in control of the machine. And yes, I'm sure there are plenty of people out there for whom I think these things are only ever a good thing, because they're people that maybe shouldn't be on the road in the first place. But when it comes to something like an RS5, a sporty, exciting car, well, it should be for somebody that is up for the business of driving. And this is. And I have always been the sort of person to champion cars which are interesting. And I think that really is the core of the argument that I'm trying to make today. People dislike EVs not because they are EVs, but because there are few and far between that you could call anything close to interesting. And they've also proven that just giving something 1,000 horsepower doesn't make it exciting. People are not clambering over one another to get into the latest Taycan or Tesla Model S or the Lotus Electra. And yes, I know all of those things, the Tesla in particular, do have their fans, but in 10, 15 years, heck, even in 5 years, they'll be old hat. They won't be exciting, they won't be interesting. They'll be a curio and nothing more. They'll be like an old fridge, because they are really just white goods. And they're not white goods because they're electric, they're white goods because they are plain, boring, ordinary cars made for the mass market. This, though, isn't. This is from the company whose logo was Vorsprung durch Technik. This would have made so much sense having a 5 or 6 cylinder turbo engine, and the cabriolet version of the S5 actually did have a 3-litre supercharged V6. But for the coupe and the RS5, they went, nah, sod it, 8,000 RPM, naturally aspirated V8. And that's a decision you only make if you're passionate. Audi could have easily built something a little less nuts, but they chose not to. They chose to build this. EVs also do a great example of proving that sometimes delayed gratification is a good thing. And I'm not just talking about turbo lag here. I mean the fact that when you put your foot down in an EV, it'll rearrange your internal organs. And that's hilarious. And whenever you get a passenger in one, if you've got a hot Tesla, I'm sure you'll enjoy giving them the feeling of just, well, being launched out of a cannon. But it does get a little bit old after a while. What doesn't is that. Even that gear shift is pretty good, you know. I mean, look, I am not going even close to the speed limit here. And I'm playing this thing like a musical instrument. Now, I know some EV manufacturers are currently trying to synthesize that, but that's all they'll ever be able to do, synthesize it. They'll never be able to truly replicate it, truly give you the feeling of being in control of 1,000 different moving parts, all working in harmony. This is magnificent. This is glorious. And this is a car that back in its day, every magazine told you, it's all right, honestly, just go and buy the M3 though. And today I'm going to tell you, don't do it. People come to me all the time and ask me, what is it that I should buy that's going to hold its money or hopefully increase in value over the next few years? Well, I'm going to tell you 2 simple things. And honestly, please, don't ever email me and ask me this ever again, because this is the answer you're going to get. Buy the car that you want and buy something interesting. Because if you do that, whatever you buy halves in value, you've still got the car that you want. And maybe, because it's interesting, one day it will be worth a lot more than you paid for it. And something like this, well, I think it's a pretty darn good choice. More interesting than an M3, every bit as livable, if not arguably even more so. And while it is very, very easy, and I'm absolutely guilty of it too, to wax lyrical about this fading light we're currently seeing, this setting of the sun that is the combustion engine, right here, right now, there is still absolutely nothing whatsoever stopping you from going out there and buying one. So I would, because for £15,000, you'd struggle to get a car that makes you feel like this. Anyway, big thank you to John for bringing his car out, and as ever, to you for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you for the next one. Bye-bye.